So in the last segment, I sort of introduced some of the ideas that we'd be talking about with World War I and the home front. In this segment, which will be relatively brief, I just want to review sort of the transformational power of the war. I had suggested when I left off that there were voices of dissonance, voices that sought to express a desire to keep the United States out of this European conflict or this capitalist conflict or this larger conflict of imperialist and nation states. But I'd also said that the United States had been preparing for war and had been doing so since roughly 1915. By 1916, the United States had gone so far as to pass the National Defense Act. And this act established a Council of National Defense to oversee preparations for what looked as if it might be U.S. entry into the First World War. Very early on in 1917, remember that the declaration of war itself comes in April of that year, but very early on, the United States will set up, for instance, the so-called War Industries Board. This board would have responsibility for coordinating military purchases, for regulating production and ensuring that production was carried out efficiently, but also for meeting military needs, seeing that military needs had priority when it came to the war effort. In May of 1917, again, very early in the war, the United States Congress passes the so-called Selective Service Act. Now, many of you will be familiar with this idea of selected service, which is preparatory, basically, to a draft. The Selective Service Act established the processes by which young men would be inducted into military service, or, put another way, of course, drafted. This act required the registration of all males ages 20 to 30. Slightly later in the war, the United States changed those ages to 18 to 45, people who would have to make themselves eligible for selection for the draft. As far as actual selection went, that was done by a lottery system through Selective Service and through local draft boards, which considered objections to the draft or saw men of military age through the draft process. By June the 5th of 1917, more than 9.5 million men had signed up for the draft lottery. By the end of the war, some 24 million American males predominantly would be registered through Selective Service. 4.8 million Americans would serve in the armed forces during the war years, and some 2 million Americans would actually serve in France on the Western Front during World War I. Now, the young men who were called up to serve were known during this period, and I dare say Melanie Stories mentioned this, but they were known as Doughboyz. And there's, I think, some dispute as to where that term comes from. One suggestion, one that I tend to stick with, is that these young men's faces were doughy, and what that would mean is they were sort of baby-faced. They still had that shape of the baby's face. They hadn't gotten a lot of age on them. The average doughboy, when they were called up and went off to training camp, the average doughboy was approximately 23 years old. White or Caucasian, single or unmarried, and apparently fairly poorly educated. Public education in the United States was very different in the early 20th century in terms of what was offered than it is now. It differed between urban and rural areas, but it was only really in in the 19 teens in whole regions of the United States that mandatory high school education was put into place beyond the basic, first through 8th grade education that so many people had access to. When the Doughboyz arrived for processing, one of the things that happened was they were given tests, both physical and psychological, to determine their capacity to serve, and they had to meet certain minimum requirements. And the results of these psychological or IQ tests that were administered, you have to call into question a bit, as you would with any IQ test, for the potential skewing of the types of questions that were asked. In other words, are there elements of bias in the questions? But accounting for that potential for bias, the results show that approximately 30% of all those called up for service who went through this battery of mental or psychological tests were considered to be really mentally challenged in some ways. In other words, they were very, very poorly educated. And that, I think, reflects in part on the United States at this period. In many ways, the United States has achieved the status of world power, but you still have cultural distinctions. So you have, for instance, immigrants, you have poverty, you have rural areas where education is not necessarily, it's not that it's not valued, it may just not be available beyond a certain minimal amount. So it says something about, I think, the United States as world power at this point. Some 18% of those called up for military service were in fact foreign born. As had happened with the Civil War, the United States depended for its military on those who were foreign born. And it actually, there's some kind of interesting parallels, because one of the recent characteristics of the American military in the 21st century, since we've been engaged in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, has been the number of foreign-born soldiers who are now serving in the U.S. military, often seeking citizenship as part of that service. You also, and it's well worth note, you also had approximately 400,000 African Americans who were called up and who served in the military, not necessarily in Europe, though many did, but called up for the U.S. military. And you have to remember that the Wilson administration would be it would institute often in federal agencies policies of segregation. Remember that progressive ideas were often quite conservative, were often directed at certain populations, that often diminished the role of political access that those populations could have. Wilson's a progressive, but he's also a Southerner. And one of the things he brings to Washington is segregation in federal agencies. It's well worth noting here that African Americans are called up, and in that capacity, many will fight. But as would happen with World War II, oftentimes African Americans are assigned to the most menial tasks. They're not always given a place on the line, although there is this great instance where African American soldiers are fighting alongside the French, and for the bravery that they display, I mean, they're eventually awarded French military honors for what they do. But they live in a segregated America. It's like those Buffalo Soldiers in the West, or the African American soldiers who fight in the Spanish-American War. Here at home, it's very seldom that they will receive what you might consider their due acknowledgement for their efforts. But it's worth mentioning, I think, that 400,000 African Americans will serve in the military. Training camps were harsh places. Alcohol was forbidden. There were leisure activities because progressives, you recall, had a concern for the sort of humanitarian reform, for moral order. They were willing to use government to achieve that, and they had also often supported prohibition. It makes perfect sense then that progressive ideas would infuse the training camps of the First World War as these doughboys went off to war. But it's also worthy of note that Jim Crow policies were enforced in these training camps, that there were distinctions drawn. In fact, segregation was part of the experience. And it matters that many of these camps were located in the American South. The changes that would come as a result of the war had much to do with government itself. One of the organizations instituted by the United States government to oversee and coordinate the war effort was the Food Administration. The head of this administration is a figure that's going to play prominently in this sort of story, this survey, in the 1920s and on into the early 1930s leading up to the New Deal. And that's, of course, the figure of Herbert Hoover. This organization, the Food Administration, had the role of overseeing the production of agricultural products, seeking to encourage that production, and also the conservation of food and agricultural products. It had the power to set prices when necessary and to regulate or oversee the actual distribution of food on the home front so that the best and most necessary foods could be used for the soldiers. It's here with the Food Administration that we can talk about, for instance, the Victory Garden. The idea that homeowners should grow their own vegetables in their backyards or in plots that they might open up. And the Food Administration encouraged conservation through the setting of particular days when certain items wouldn't be eaten. So, for instance, you had meatless meals and wheatless meals, avoiding bread or excess use of bread or sometimes sacrificing meat. The government created a railroad administration whose primary purpose was to oversee what could be a very snarled transportation network, but also to assist those railroads which were already experiencing financial issues, but were nonetheless necessary for the work of the war, for mobilization. We're talking here about moving resources around the country as well as moving troops to where they needed to be and getting goods to America's ports where they could then be shipped overseas in support of the United States military. During the war, the government also took the opportunity to take over, essentially, and run America's utilities, things like the telegraph and the telephone. This nationalization, though temporary, was something that had been talked about in terms of utilities since the sort of radical days going back to the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance. One of the most important of the wartime agencies, however, was the War Industries Board. And I mentioned it somewhat earlier, but I want to go into sort of greater depth here. The War Industries Board was brought into existence in July of 1917. It was, in effect, a clearinghouse to coordinate the economy. The Food Administration looked to agriculture, but the War Industries Board could do so as well. But I think the emphasis really is on the productive, the industrial and manufacturing productive capacity of the United States. Now, before I get into the War Industries Board, I'd like to take just a moment and I want to talk briefly about something I kind of skipped over before, and that's American industry. And I want to focus, sort of using him for an example, on one figure in particular, and that's a fellow by the name of Henry Ford. Now, most everybody's heard about Henry Ford. We associate Ford predominantly with the American automobile. And if you know the story, you know that as early as 1896, Ford had come up with what would be his first automobile, which was the quadricycle. It was a very kind of simple gasoline-powered car, not dissimilar from a small carriage in many ways. But it's what Ford does afterward that impacts this story of World War I more. It's not the invention of the car. I don't think we can give him credit for that, though when I was young, a lot of the books I read suggested that was the case. Instead, I think Ford, number one, will develop products for sale that will allow the products themselves to become sellable. And it didn't make much sense, but here's what I mean by that. Ford is very much moving the United States into becoming a sort of consumer society. And he's doing that by producing goods that average people, that a middle-class family could afford. Things like the Model T. They're not flashy. They're not fancy. It was said about the Model T, of course, that you could get the Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. In other words, they're just not going to be frivolous. They're not worried too much about comfort. They're not worried too much about color and difference and distinction. They're worried about reliability. They're worried about cost. And that's part of Ford's genius, probably, that he understood you could reach a mass market of potential consumers if you had the right product. Well, in 1908, Ford introduces the Model T, which is kind of that iconic consumer's product. But it's really in the years immediately leading up to the war that we see Ford sort of pushing that concept of creating the affordable product a little bit further. Specifically, in 1913, just before the war breaks out in Europe, Henry Ford begins at his Highland Park facility, his factory at Highland Park. He begins operating the first moving assembly line. And what he achieves is really the ultimate manifestation of this notion of making small parts into big parts, that one's job along this assembly line could be a matter of taking two parts and putting them together, and that's your job. It's not completing a car from beginning to end. It's assembling two parts that ultimately, combined with maybe thousands of other parts, would become a finished product. But you have only one repetitive, simple task, which means, of course, you can hire people that don't have to be terribly well skilled to carry this out. So in 1913, Ford institutes this idea of the moving assembly line, and with it achieves great efficiency in terms of production. Efficiency that will absolutely shape the 1920s and industry and business in the 20s. He also does something else just before the war. In January of 1914, Ford announces that he's going to offer his workers $5 a day for 8 hours of work. It's absolutely unheard of. $5 a day for 8 hours of work. Now, what does this mean? Why? Why is he doing this? Well, you have to consider that one of the problems Ford faced because of the nature of assembly line work was retention of labor. He had to be concerned about the prospects of unionization, but he also didn't want what you might call a skills drain. He wanted, once someone was trained to do a job well, he wanted them to stay in place so that he could avoid the cost of retraining. A third element here goes to his competition. By and large, the competition that Ford faced for labor had its labor working 9-hour days for about half of that $5 daily wage that Ford was offering. If he could push his competition to try and keep up with a $5 a day, 8-hour a day work schedule and pay, potentially he threatened to put them in financial ruin, thus taking care of competition. So that's part of the deal here too, but there's one more thing to consider. And that's the idea that if Ford pays his workers $5 a day, he will be putting them in a position to actually purchase the products which he's manufacturing, that a worker at a Ford plant would eventually be able to buy a Ford, which is this affordable, no play on words there, but it is an affordable vehicle. And thus, Ford ends up increasing his own company's sales. So there are a number of different factors that go into this. But understand the impact that Ford's having on the way American industry works. It's just beginning to be fully felt during the First World War. And it falls to the War Industries Board to oversee management of this fluid and dynamic system of production that has just begun to evolve, and to make sure that the war effort gets first priority. The War Industries Board had the power to oversee purchases for the war effort, to allocate resources and supplies to manufacturers based on what sense there was that the products manufactured were needed for the war effort. The War Industries Board, while it couldn't outright kind of establish prices, it could nonetheless work with companies, with manufacturing plants and corporations to sort of cooperatively arrive at prices. It's not exactly price fixing, but it's pretty daggum close. Another thing, given what Ford was doing, remember with this moving assembly line, was that the War Industries Board encouraged the standardization of practices. Part of that's done through defense contracts. Part of that's done through what the government requires of you if you want the money, if you want the pay, the contract. But by using the government contracts to establish what standards are acceptable, the tendency is also to gradually move diverse companies and corporations toward a process of standardized production. And that's exactly what Ford has already moved to and done it to increase efficiency, but he's moving his factories towards standardization, right? Do one job, you repeat it every time, parts are just the same, they're interchangeable, and the line moves and you move on. So you could argue that the War Industries Board here encourages changes in the way Americans produced goods that were far more standardized and arguably would be more efficient. One other thing that the War Industries Board had some responsibility for is maintaining conditions in the workplace that would prevent labor unrest and could potentially threaten the continued supply of goods to the war effort. About a quarter of all United States production during the war was diverted to war needs, to meeting war needs. There were problems like bureaucracy, a lack of ships and weapons deliveries that had to be solved through a bureaucracy that could be, as are all bureaucracies, paper heavy, form heavy. In the winter of 1917 and 1918, there were coal shortages. I think the United States was not used to, nor was the bureaucracy really in place or efficient enough to organize this kind of centralized economic planning. So there are problems that result. And there was another major problem, and that is inflation wholesale price index in the United States, and that's kind of an index or an average of wholesale prices for goods before they're sold in stores, increased some 98% between 1913, what prices had been in 1913, and what they would be in 1918. On the retail side, 1918, 1919, you're seeing inflation that's running about 15%. That's huge. That's huge inflation. And inflation, remember, is when prices go up, or in essence, put another way, the value of a good, the inherent value of a good goes down. In other words, just the same dollar won't buy as much of that good, right? So you can't buy as much. But basically, inflation just means that the value of your dollar goes down. It takes more dollars to buy the same thing. There are as well, under the War Industries Board, and this is worth mentioning, approximately 200 corporate mergers in 1917 alone. So remember, the War Industries Board here is not breaking new ground oftentimes, but government is being used to reinforce the status quo. Standardization is already underway. Government takes a role. Corporate mergers, well, they've been underway for a long time. And here again, to achieve efficiencies, government is willing to take a role, not busting trusts this time, but actually providing for mergers for the purposes of the war. Those are just a few of the government activities that I think are very reflective of sort of the progressive influence and its attitude toward government that we see used during the war effort. We'll talk more in the next segment about how the war affects workers and other groups socially within the United States.